Matt and I are going to make kraut today. Kraut really plays a huge role in the traditional Appalachian foodways. It was something that people could make. Almost all those kind of traditional Appalachian foodways lead back to some way of preserving so that you could make it through the winter, you know. Well, people would grow cabbage. Of course, you can save cabbage by burying it. They would bury it. They would have spring houses and different things where you can keep it underground. It'll keep for a long time by layering hay and things like that. But kraut, making kraut with it, is preserving cabbage with salt. Give a different way of preserving it and a different taste. You know, it added flavor to the diet. So I'm going to read you the entry for kraut in the Dictionary of Smoky Mountain English. Kraut is a noun, sauerkraut, and I'll stop right there just to say it's really interesting in Appalachia. When people talk about sauerkraut, you never really hear that. You just hear kraut. People just call it kraut, whether they're making kraut or eating kraut. They don't really say sauerkraut, which of course kraut or sauerkraut is common throughout the world, not just in Appalachia. But here's the rest of the entry. So noun, sauerkraut, widely made in the mountains, stored in barrels and kept for winter consumption. The food is the most significant German contribution to mountain cuisine, and the term is one of very few from German in the mountain vocabulary. 1913, Capehart, our Southern Highlanders. In the vocabulary of the mountaineers, I have detected only 3 words of directly foreign origin. Donny is one of them. Another is kraut, which is the sole contribution to Highland speech of those numerous Germans, mostly Pennsylvania Dutch, who joined the first settlers in this region and whose descendants form today a considerable element of the Highland population. 1939, Walker, mountaineer. The German word kraut survived for the obvious reason that there was no equivalent in the technical vocabulary of the Scotch-Irish housewife. 1960, Mason memoir. The barrels were utilized as containers for the storage of such mountain commodities as sauerkraut, pickled beans, bleached apples, and pumpkin butter. 1962, Hall Collection, Newport, Tennessee. A pregnant woman will spoil kraut or the mash from a run of liquor. A woman, when her menstrual period is on, when she makes kraut, it will rot. 1973, Great Smoky Mountain National Park. We would put a cloth over the kraut now and pickled beans. And we'd put this big plank, and then we'd hunt and get us a big heavy rock, wash it off right clean, and put it on the plank, and that would mash it down in below kraut. And that's how we would have it, you know. The kraut and pickled beans, you know, that kraut was so good, we would just go get us a handful, squeeze the juice out, and just eat a big handful. 1977, Madden and Jones, Mountain Home. Pickled beans and kraut were kept in large stone crocks in the spring house. Then the second entry for kraut in the dictionary, there's an A and a B. The A was the noun part that I just read, and then the B is a verb. So if you're going to kraut something, it's like using it like that. You're actually making sauerkraut, but they're saying it can be used as a verb. I've not heard it used like this, but the entry says to make sauerkraut out of. So 1917, Capehart word list. I don't do like old Miss Posey, kraut my cabbage whole. So old Miss Posey krauted her cabbage whole. I guess she submerged maybe the whole cabbage in a brine of salt. I'm not sure how she would do that. But I guess another example of that, like you can make turnip kraut. So you could say, using it as a verb, you would say, I'm going to kraut my turnips today. I guess is how you would say that one. So when it comes to making kraut, just like everything else, there's just various ways that people do it, different methods that they used. You can do a search online and you'll find all kinds of different methods and ways. Even in my own family, there's people that use different ways. So traditionally, Matt and I, the way we do it is that we just use the cabbage and salt. We mix them together and then we let it ferment. Granny, the way she does hers is she goes ahead and packs her kraut in the jars, and she puts a teaspoon of sugar, she puts the cabbage in there, she puts 2 teaspoons of salt in the top, and then she fills it with cold water, and then she puts the lid and the rings on it, and she sits it outside, so when it's working, because it'll start fermenting and bubbling up, it doesn't make a big mess. Even in that, there's people that like really coarse sauerkraut. There's people that like it really fine, and they use a food processor. Sometimes we use a food processor, sometimes we use knives and chop it up the way it doesn't matter. Then when you get it actually fermented, there's some people that say, and that's what we do, like after 14 days, 14 to 21 days, you can start tasting it and see if it's fermented to your liking. There's other people, like Granny, when she puts hers in those jars, she never checks it. She just sets those jars outside on her porch, and so that when they work off, it won't make a big mess, and then she just leaves them till cold weather, and then she puts them in the basement where she keeps her canned goods. And that's just how she does it. She doesn't really ever check them. She's just sure that it'll be good, and that's how she does it. Then once it is fermented, if you're doing the fermented method or if you're doing the method Granny does, another debate is, well, do you can it or not? If you put it in jars and then you water bath it, you can do that. Obviously Granny doesn't do that, but you can do that, like how Matt and I make it. You can do that and water bath it for 5 or 10 minutes. There's other people that say, well, of course, if you water bath it, you're killing all that good fermentation. You're killing all the good bacteria that's in there that's supposed to be so beneficial and good for you. So if you just make a very small amount, it's very easy. You just put it in your refrigerator, and it'll last a long time. It'll continue to ferment in there, and you can eat it that way. There's some people that just make those small amounts of ferments, whether it's cabbage or carrots or anything that they're doing, and they make a jar and then they eat it till it's gone. Then they make another jar and they eat it till it's gone, storing it in the refrigerator, and that way they kind of get that great benefits of the fermentation, but they don't ever have to worry about whether to can it or how to do that. So there's varying different ways out there, and I'm sure Ball Cannon Book probably has a recipe that you could check out if you want to. I'm going to show you today how Matt and I make ours. And there's so many, it's really an easy recipe, but an easy thing to do. Of course, people's been doing it for generations, for eons, but there's so many different little moving pieces of it that certain people do it right this way and certain people do it that way, and it doesn't matter that doesn't mean one of them's wrong and one of them's right. You just have to figure out what works for you and what works best. Like Granny, how she figured out what she liked. And then the way Matt and I do it, those are just two different ways, but we both found out what way works best for us and what we like to do. So another thing you have to decide, if you're not making it, and you can make it like Matt and I do with just the salt and the cabbage in a jar, in a mason jar, and do it that way, you can do that. But if you're going to do it like Granny does, of course the decision's already made for you. That's how you're going to make it. But if you're going to make a large quantity, then you got to decide, well, what are you going to ferment it in? What are you going to use? You can, from the dictionary, you could hear them, what they used. They used barrels. Those were like wooden barrels in those days. After they quit using wooden barrels, they started using crocks. Now I have here's a small crock, so like a stoneware crock that I showed you. We have large ones, and we've used those before a lot to make pickled beans and corn or kraut or whatever, or pickles, whatever we were doing. The thing about the large ones is they're very heavy, so if you have a hard time lifting stuff, they're very heavy, and they crack so easily, and they're expensive to buy. And a lot of times you might find them at maybe an antique store or thrift store or something like that, but you have to be very careful. The cracks, sometimes when they crack, is not obvious. So you may think, well, look, I found this and it's beautiful and it's perfect, and you don't realize that it's not watertight, and it has to be watertight. Has to keep all that goodness of the salt and the brine and the liquid in there to be able to use it. So that's one issue with them, although I still love that traditional way of using the crocks. Then you can use, I've never tried this, but I've heard people say you can use food grade plastic containers, like plastic 5-gallon buckets and stuff. You think about restaurants, they get them, they buy stuff. They're not like us at the grocery store. They buy large quantities, so a lot of times they might come in a plastic bucket like that that's food grade. So I've heard people say you could use those. You can use mason jars, as I said below, or said a minute ago, and that Granny uses every year. I love this little crock. I like the big crocks too, but last year I started thinking about it, because it does get tiresome to try to lift those big crocks, and every time I bring them upstairs or I take them back to the basement, I'm always afraid that I'm going to crack it. It's just worrisome the whole time. and one of the ones we have was Matt's grandmother, so it's really precious to us. So last year when I was thinking about that, I thought, well, why couldn't I use just a big glass container? So I started thinking about glass containers, and I had one or two that Granny give me, that I guess they're old pickle jars or whatever. I remember when I was young, Granny and Pap would get milk from some of their friends who had a cow, and we would swap out these big jars at church, and that's what we had the milk in. Anyway, so Granny, I have those jars, but I usually put pickles in them. But I thought about them, but the top is smaller, so it'd be hard to get your hand down in there and really work on the cabbage. So then I started thinking about canisters, like just that they sell at big box stores at Walmart or wherever, that you might put cookies in, you might put your flour or sugar or whatever in. So I bought a couple of those, a couple of different sizes of those, and they worked so well. So if you didn't have that much cabbage, or if you just wanted to make a smaller amount, or if you wanted to buy 2 or 3 of them and make the same amount but have it more manageable as far as moving them around instead of a big crock. So that's what I did last year, and it worked very well. So that's what I'll be using today, is one of those, and they're very affordable compared to the price of a crock. I do love, though, the history of using the crocks, and I like using them if I make 14-day pickles. I use a crock for that. Those glass containers I was talking about work really well for that too, depending on how many you're making. But there's just something about using that traditional method of the crocks that really appeals to me, even though they are, like I said, they're expensive, they're hard to handle without breaking, and they're heavy if you use the large ones. One of my favorite stories about those old crocks and about making kraut comes from my father-in-law, Papa Tony. He told me years ago, and I've just never forgot it, that his mother, there was 8 children in the family, big family when he was growing up. Of course, they had to put up a lot of food to make it through the winter. And she would make kraut and pickle beans and corn through the summer as things began to come in. She just kind of had an ongoing, cycle of it. And then once they were made, she actually would can them. She would take the fermented things out and put them in jars and can them and put them in wherever they kept their canned goods for winter. But the very last one of the season, the crocks, she had several crocks that she would have going with kraut or pickled beans or whatever. Once she had filled up all her jars, she would just leave the stuff in those, and they would eat those first. So that's kind of how their family did it. But my favorite part of it is, he said when he was a boy and he knew whether it was the ones that she was going to put in the jar or if it was that last one of the year, that he knew, where they kept the fermenting things in the crocks. And if he was out playing, he would run in there, and his mother, another thing that's different, another variation that depends on who's making the kraut, is that some people put the core in there with the kraut and some people don't. It's just a personal preference, kind of like Miss Posey krauting the whole cabbage, it's just personal preference. So Laura, Tony's mother, Papa Tony's mother, she would cut the core into, the little core, and she, instead of chopping it up, she would just put the whole piece down in the liquid and kraut it too. Well, he said, so when he was outside playing and he was hungry, he would think about that, and he would know that he could sneak in there and nobody would know it. And he said he would reach his little grimy hand down in there and he'd find one of those cores and pull it out and then take it with him to eat, for a snack, so that he didn't have to go in the house and worry about getting something to eat. And he said he could remember that, little grimy hands, how you are when you're little and you're playing outside. But after he'd go in there and do that with the kraut, then his arm would be clean to about right up there, So that's just a funny story he'd tell. He said if his mother had ever caught him doing that, she would probably beat him to death, but she never did catch him. Probably the most Appalachian thing about making kraut, and it's another one of those that you have to find your own way, and kind of different families do it different ways, is when to make kraut. So when you make kraut, you're really fermenting. We use that interchangeable with pickles. I might say I'm pickling kraut today, or making pickle beans and corn. What I mean is I'm fermenting it, but then if I say I'm making bread and butter pickles, well, I'm really pickling it with vinegar. So kind of that gets confusing because we use them interchangeably. But anyway, so when's the best time to ferment? So, like I said, different families have different things, and we go by the signs. So go by the signs means that we're following the zodiac signs. Each zodiac sign has a corresponding body part. So you'll hear people say, I only ferment Like for my family, and Matt's family is the same way, so it's like when we first got married, that was one thing we didn't have to worry about. Our families were both the same, is that we want to ferment when the signs are in the head. You just seem to have a better product when you do that. Other families, Matt has an aunt that she prefers to ferment make her kraut when the signs are in the heart. I've heard people say, well, you should make sure the sign is, you should aim for maybe the head, but you should make sure that the sign is at least above the heart. So then there's a neck sign. You can learn more about that, but for our family, we prefer to pickle, or to ferment, really is what we're doing, when the signs are in the head. And an easy way to find out where the sign is, if you are interested in that, you may not be, and that's okay, is that you can look for the Farmer's Almanac, tells that kind of information. In the area where I live, funeral homes and banks and even insurance companies, in January when they start giving out their calendars, a lot of times they'll give out what's called a planning calendar. And that calendar will have all those corresponding, will tell all the moon phases and all the zodiac signs, and will tell all that kind of information. So it makes an easy reference for you to just to look at and to know. Another option when making kraut that many people do is they put peppers in it. Some people like hot peppers, some people just add some bell peppers or some banana peppers. That kind of gives it a slightly different flavor. It gives it some, as far as being pretty, it gives it some color, but it also will help, depending on how much peppers you might use, it might make your cabbage go further if you were worrying about that. Now, some people call pickled beans and corn, and some people put cabbage in it. Well, some people call that just like mixed pickles or mixed vegetables, that their mother made mixed. They call it mixed. We would call it pickled beans and corn even though it had cabbage in it. Or we would call it kraut even though it might have peppers in it. As far as what kind of cabbage to use, or where to get your cabbage. If you grow a garden, of course, you'll have cabbage on hand. If you don't, supermarket, or better than that, like a produce stand or a farmer's market, that's the great place to get stuff, buy it directly from the farmer. Those places are wonderful to get cabbage. If you don't have access to that, you can literally buy it at the grocery store and make kraut from it that way. I would look for very firm cabbage. You want it to be firm and fresh. The same with the peppers that you're gonna, if you add or if you choose not to add. In my area where I live, it's just really common to hear people say Nantahala cabbage is what you want, that Nantahala cabbage is the best. It's so pretty and so white and so crisp. And Nantahala traditionally would stay like slightly cooler than where I'm at here, so it makes sense, even though I'm, 35 minutes maybe from Nantahala. So it kind of makes sense that good cabbage would grow there, because cabbage is more of a cold weather or cool weather vegetable. So now that I've given you probably more information than you ever wanted to know about kraut, I'm going to show you how Matt and I make kraut. So Matt's chopped up some bell peppers and some jalapenos to give the kraut some flavor and some color as well, just to make it pretty in the jars. You can see my glass container I was talking about. It has a lid that goes with it. It's really like a glass canister, but it just works really well. The one thing that I didn't mention a minute when I was talking about kraut, the variations and all that kind of stuff, the steps that you need, is you need salt. Well, what kind of salt? You need to either use kosher salt or pickling salt to ferment with. You don't want to use one that has that's been iodized. You don't want to use table salt. So kosher salt or pickling salt, either one will work fine. And as far as for the basic amounts, for every 10 cups, every 8 to 10 cups of cabbage, or you will include the peppers in that too, you want to use a tablespoon of salt. And as you go, you layer the cabbage and the peppers. We'll mix all those together, and then we'll layer that salt, and we'll begin to mix them together with our hands, or Matt's hands. He's going to actually do this, and we'll show you the kind of the way you kind of think of it as massaging. You're massaging it down in there, and once you begin to do that, that salt, it draws out the liquid from the peppers and especially from the cabbage. I mean, if you're making kraut, that's what you want. And so that, as it draws that moisture out, the moisture and the salt make the brine that actually pickle or ferment the mixture. This kraut will be really exciting for us because this is cabbage that we grew instead of having to buy it, so that's pretty cool. As far as what to do with your extra leaves, you want to save a few of the larger leaves to actually help submerge the kraut down in. If you're using a jar or a crock, But otherwise, you feed them to your chickens, put them in the compost pile, or cook them and eat them, whatever you want to. Those outer leaves, sometimes they can be tough and need to be discarded, or they may be dirty from the garden too. So this is the part I was talking about. The Matt will begin to massage and kind of work the cabbage and try to get the moisture to start coming out after he's mixed the first part of salt in there. Again, as I said, it's just personal preference. You can see Matt's left the cabbage kind of on the coarse side, pretty large pieces. Other people chop it pretty fine with a knife or maybe in long strips, and then other people put it in a food processor and do it really quick and it's really fine. That's how Granny does hers. If you do that fine method, it does help. The moisture comes out quicker than if you leave it the larger pieces, but it's just kind of personal preference. So if you have a hard time massaging it after it's already in the crock, sometimes it's awkward to get in there and my hands are not as strong or as large as Matt. A good tip is to put it out in a bowl and put your salt that way and just really massage it that way and get the liquid flowing before you ever start packing it in the crock. So by massaging the cabbage and the peppers and trying to release that liquid, what we're trying to do is to get the liquid that is released, that brine, to come above the mixture, to come above the kraut and the peppers. In this case, since we use peppers, you want them totally submerged. You could leave this and let it set for an hour or so and come back, and nature would do part of that work for you. It's going to continue to release liquid. If you just can't seem to get the liquid to come out, or you just can't seem to ever get it above it, you can make a brine from 2 teaspoons of salt. Again, you would need to use kosher or pickling salt and a cup of water and pour that brine over it because you need it all submerged. And keeping it submerged is so that it will ferment, so that it will all ferment, but it also keeps it, if you can keep it below that line, then it cuts down on any other kind of bad bacteria that you don't want to be in there. So you can see when Matt pushes down, the liquid is coming up above the cabbage. That's what you want to see. So once you've got the liquid where you want it, rising above the kraut and the peppers, then you got to figure out how to submerge it, how to keep it submerged. You need to weight it down. In the old days, like we read in the dictionary entry, a lot of older women, they would go to the creek and they would find a rock that fit in their crock, and they would clean it up really good and scrub it, and they just kept it in their kitchen or with their pickling stuff, and that's what they used. People use saucers. That's probably what we've used most often over the years, a saucer or a plate. In recent years, what I've used that's worked really well is to fill a Ziploc bag full of water and put it down in there, and it kind of seals it off. Once you have it weighted down like you want it, you can see that there's a lot of little pieces of cabbage inside on the walls. I try to wipe all that down as best you can. It's hard to get it all. And then once you put the weight on it, then you want to cover it loosely. You don't want to cover it with something real tight fit, and you want it to be able for the air to move in and out of it. I usually drape a towel over it. I might tie the towel around the edges. But that's just to keep any kind of flies or bugs or people from dropping stuff in it, whatever, to kind of offer it some protection. Then you're going to let it sit, like I said, 14 to 21 days. Some years it seems to take longer than that. Everybody's kitchen and home is different. The heat of your home, the bacteria that's in your home that's going to actually ferment it. So that's just kind of something you have to play around with and learn. And it seems some years mine might, in 14 days, it's good to go, ready for me to can or put in the refrigerator or eat or do whatever we're going to do with it. In other years, it seems like it takes a lot longer than that. So that's something that you'll just have to play around with. You need to check it every day or every couple of days and just look at it and kind of make sure it's okay. You'll begin to see bubbles kind of start going up through the thing, and that's when you know it's actually working, as bubbles will be traveling up through the mixture, and you can tell that it's actually working then. But just keep an eye on it. So a lot of people have told me, well, I've tried that and it gets moldy and I threw it all out. I didn't know what to do and I was afraid I'd poison my family. Well, it's totally normal for the very top for there to be some scum and some little moldy looking places. If it was to go really bad, if it was to really rot and be terrible, you would know it. There'd be no doubt in your mind. If you if you get rid of the little scummy mold and you kind of scoop out any little brown places and then you taste it and it tastes okay or it smells okay, it smells like a fermented thing, then you're good to go. If it's truly bad, it will be so horrific that you won't even be able to stand to smell it. And it may even have bugs in it. I mean, literally, it may have stuff crawling around in it. So if it actually goes bad, then you would know. My best advice, though, is to start very small, so then you don't waste a whole crock of kraut. If you're unsure, try it in a very small mason jar, even a smaller container than we've used today, a little glass canister. And that way, if it turns out great, you can put it in the refrigerator and enjoy it and eat it and try it again. And the more experience you get with it, or if it turns out bad, you've not wasted that much. So when you're starting to chop up your cabbage, you want to keep some of the outer leaves so that you can use those as kind of a barrier between whatever you're going to weight it down and the actual mixture. And you can just kind of tuck them down in the edges. So once you have the leaves all pushed down around the edges, you can see the liquid's beginning to come up on them already. That's what you want. And then you can take your weight, whether you're using a plate or a plastic bag like I am, and put it in there on top. And you'll notice the liquid will even come up even further. And that's what you want. You want your cabbage, your kraut, to be totally submerged. Plastic bag full of water really does good because it kind of molds to it. The only thing you got to worry about is you want to use if a hole got in the bag, then all the water would come out. But usually if you're careful, you don't have to worry about that. And then I just take a old towel or flour sack and put over the top of it, and I'll get Matt to tie a loose knot around it just to prevent anything, and that way it can still breathe through the fabric. Hope you enjoyed seeing how Matt and I make kraut. Like I said, there's tons of different ways that people do it, and you just have to find the way that works best for you. Here's a jar of what we made last year. You can see how pretty it is. We didn't put peppers in it last year, but it's still pretty and it's really good. I love to eat kraut with cornbread. What doesn't go good with cornbread, right? We like to eat it with sausage, like kielbasa sausage. I like it just straight out of the jar, to be honest with you. And I even have a chocolate cake recipe that calls for kraut. Ain't that crazy? A dear friend, shared that with me many years ago. And it's a tasty cake, and you really don't taste the kraut at all. But you know it's in there because you put it in there. So I hope you'll leave any comment and let me know. Do you like kraut? Do you make kraut? Did you grow up with kraut? But mostly, as always, I just hope you'll keep dropping back by and helping me celebrate Appalachia, which includes all the wonderful foodways of Appalachia.